Eritrea's journey from a colonized territory to an independent state is one of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimately, heartbreaking betrayal. Located along the Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, Eritrea has long been a place where the dreams of its people collided with the harsh realities of geopolitics and war. Once a land of promise, it is now one of the most repressive nations in the world. Its story, however, is far from ordinary. The tale begins in the late 19th century when Eritrea became an Italian colony, a small but significant foothold for European imperial ambitions in East Africa. Over decades, Eritrea endured the rule of multiple colonial powers, Italy, Britain, and eventually Ethiopia, all while nurturing a fierce desire for self-determination. When that desire finally bloomed into a successful independence movement in the 1990s, led by the charismatic and determined Isaias Afwerki, Eritrea was lauded as an emerging African success story. But what should have been the birth of a free, democratic nation took a darker turn. Isaias, once hailed as a liberator, tightened his grip on power, betraying the very ideals of freedom and justice for which so many had fought and died. This is the story of how a struggle for independence gave way to dictatorship, how a leader once celebrated became a tyrant, and how the dreams of a people were slowly suffocated by the very hand that helped achieve them. To fully grasp how Eritrea became a dictatorship, we must understand the complex history that shaped it, the colonial legacy, the brutal war for independence, the hopes pinned on freedom, and the power dynamics that eventually ensnared an entire nation under autocratic rule. This is not just a story of politics and war, it is a story of lost dreams, broken promises, and the indomitable human spirit. Once part of the ancient kingdom of Aksum and later an Italian colony, Eritrea's modern identity took shape in the shadow of colonialism. Italy ruled it from 1890 to 1941, a period marked by exploitation and the imposition of an Italian cultural footprint. But World War II changed everything. When Italy fell, Britain took control as a temporary custodian, but the question remained, what would become of Eritrea? In 1952, the United Nations brokered a federation between Eritrea and Ethiopia, an arrangement that pleased neither side. For Eritreans, this compromise was a betrayal of their aspirations for independence. Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, viewed Eritrea as a rightful part of its territory, eager to consolidate power over the region. 10 years later, the federation crumbled when Haile Selassie annexed Eritrea, transforming it into an Ethiopian province. Eritrean autonomy was dismantled, and with it, the seeds of rebellion were firmly planted. By the early 1960s, the desire for independence had ignited a guerrilla movement. The Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, emerged as the leading resistance group. Initially fueled by pan-Arab support, particularly from Egypt and Syria, the ELF waged a war for freedom. But the group was fragmented along ethnic and religious lines. Christian highlanders clashed with Muslim lowlanders over the movement's direction. It was within these divisions that a young engineering student named Isaias Afwerki began to rise. Born in 1946 in Asmara, Isaias had studied in Ethiopia before joining the ELF in the mid-1960s. But his ambition and ideological fervor would not let him remain a mere foot soldier. Dissatisfied with the ELF's internal disarray, Isaias sought to create a more disciplined, Marxist-inspired movement. In 1970, Isaias and like-minded rebels broke away from the ELF to form the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, EPLF. This new group positioned itself as the vanguard of the Eritrean independence struggle. Unlike the ELF, the EPLF focused on unity, discipline, and ideological purity. It embraced Marxism, gender equality, and self-reliance. Isaias soon emerged as its unchallenged leader, cultivating a reputation for ruthless efficiency and intellectual rigor. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the EPLF waged a brutal war against Ethiopia, which was now under the control of the Marxist Derg regime, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam. The conflict was characterized by staggering violence, deprivation, and suffering. Yet, the EPLF endured, driven by Isaias's charismatic leadership and his insistence on total loyalty. By the late 1980s, the EPLF was poised for victory, with Ethiopia weakened by internal strife and the Derg on the verge of collapse. In 1991, Mengistu's regime fell, and the EPLF marched triumphantly into Asmara. Eritrea's long war for independence was over. 2 years later, in 1993, Eritreans voted overwhelmingly in a UN-supervised referendum for independence, officially becoming a sovereign nation. At that moment, Isaias Afwerki was the hero of the Eritrean people. He became the country's first president, admired as the leader who had delivered freedom. Eritrea was seen as a beacon of possibility, a country that had emerged from decades of war with a bright future ahead. However, the seeds of dictatorship were already taking root. After independence, Isaias began to consolidate his grip on power. Eritrea's new constitution, drafted in 1997, promised democratic governance and the protection of human rights. But it was never implemented. Instead, Isaias concentrated authority in his hands. The EPLF was transformed into the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, PFDJ, the sole legal political party. Opposition was silenced. Critical voices within the government were dismissed, imprisoned, or exiled. Eritrea's first and only national elections were indefinitely postponed. Isaias justified his actions by claiming the country needed to focus on development and national security, not democracy, especially with tensions brewing with Ethiopia. In 1998, a border dispute with Ethiopia over the town of Badme erupted into full-scale war. For 2 years, Eritrea and Ethiopia fought a bloody, senseless conflict that resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. Though a ceasefire was signed in 2000, the war served as a pretext for Isaias to tighten his grip on power. The border war became the perfect excuse to militarize the entire society. Mandatory military service already in place became indefinite. Eritreans, men and women alike, were conscripted into national service, often for life and subjected to harsh conditions, forced labor, and abuse. Eritrea became a garrison state. In September 2001, Isaias Afwerki unleashed one of his most infamous crackdowns. 11 senior government officials and former allies who had called for democratic reforms, the so-called G15, were arrested. Independent media outlets were shut down, journalists were jailed, and political dissent was eradicated. None of the G15 were ever seen again, reportedly held in secret prisons. This event marked Eritrea's descent into full autocracy. Isaias had removed any remaining checks on his power, cementing a one-man rule that persists to this day. By the 2010, Eritrea had become one of the world's most repressive states. Its people faced a choice: endure life under dictatorship or flee. Thousands chose the latter, making perilous journeys across deserts and seas to escape indefinite conscription, torture, and poverty. Internationally isolated, Eritrea earned the nickname Africa's North Korea. Human rights organizations documented widespread abuses, including forced labor, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary detention. Isaias remained defiant, portraying Eritrea as a nation under siege, needing his leadership to survive. In 2018, a surprising peace agreement was signed between Eritrea and Ethiopia, ending 2 decades of hostility. The deal earned Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed a Nobel Peace Prize. Yet for Eritreans, it brought little relief. Despite the formal end to the war, Eritrea's policies of repression continued, and the military service requirement remained in place. Isaias remains in power, aging but unyielding, ruling through fear, secrecy, and the absence of institutions that could challenge him.